Hello, welcome to this webinar on Swedish naming patterns. I'm going to talk about person name variations and the Malachi Namesake Pattern, but I'm very, very happy to be here today. I'm Sister Cynthia Hallen, and I'm a part-time service missionary here at the Brigham Young University Library Family History Center. Well, in Swedish baptism rituals, most children would receive the first name of a close relative. For hundreds of years, families living in Sweden followed a christening pattern that replicated the names of their ancestors. The replication of Swedish given names is inherently genealogical, creating a network of DNA-like kinship tokens from generation to generation. This naming practice creates many duplicate names for different individuals, with extensive repetition and variation throughout families for many, many generations. A knowledge of this onomastic pattern of replication, mutation, and recombination can enhance family history research. I decided to call this pattern the Malachi naming pattern, and it is the practice of naming infant sons and daughters after relatives following an underlying general pattern. The first son is the namesake of the father's father. The second son is the namesake of the mother's father. The third son is the namesake of the father, and the fourth son is the namesake of a paternal or maternal uncle. The first daughter is the namesake of the father's mother. The second daughter is the namesake of the mother's mother. The third daughter is the namesake of the mother. And the fourth daughter, if they have another daughter, is the namesake of a paternal or maternal aunt. This is a pattern with many variations, but the overall pattern is the template that guides the naming pattern for many, many years in Sweden. It was standard practice in Lutheran parishes of Sweden until the mid-1800s. I want to start with an overview so you'll know where we're going. I'm going to talk about some principles of people, places, dates, and databases. And then I'm going to talk about the Swedish namesake systems. So I'm kind of skipping the order here. I'm going to talk briefly about patronymics, and then I'm going to talk about that Malachi birth order that we just looked at. And this will tie into the second part in the middle there, Swedish person name variations, which includes compounding and clipping, linguistic terms for things that can happen to words. You can put morphemes together and compound them, like in names like Edgar or Gertrude, which really have two meaningful parts to them in many, many languages. And then you can clip names like Katarina can become Kaisa or Katrina. And so we're going to take a little bit of a look at that. For principles, I want to start with some things that we can keep in mind. Personal names are about people. This isn't just about data. And the purpose of names is remembrance. The beauty of names is connection. The nature of names is repetition and variation. Like all language, the nature of language itself depends on repetition and variation, so we shouldn't be surprised that there are naming patterns that rely on repetition, but also are balanced with variation. The power of names is identity. And what I mean by that is that if you have names and you have particular places and dates that go with those names, you can either create a unique identity or find the unique identity of someone who has lived on this earth. Swedish naming patterns are based on what we call kinship terms. So the word for father is fader, and it gets clipped to the word far. And the word for mother is moder, and that gets clipped to the word mor. And then the paternal grandfather becomes the farfar, meaning the father's father. And the paternal grandmother becomes the farmor, meaning the father's mother. The maternal grandfather is the morfar, mother's father. Maternal grandmother, mormor, mother's mother. A brother would be broder, but it most likely will be bror. It gets reduced. But the word for sister just says sister, at least when it's by itself. Uncle is a farbror or a morbror. An aunt, depending on if it's the mother's sister or the father's sister, will be moster or farster. And Google Translate said papa's sister. The word for cousin is cousin, and the word for daughter is dotter, and the word for son is son. The word for child is barn. That would be like the Scottish word bairn. And then a grandchild is a barn. And then the ancestor is a förfader. If any of you are native Swedish speakers, I love Swedish, and I hope you'll be comfortable with my attempts to speak the Swedish words properly. I started out with a principle that names are about people. So I wanted you to see min mor. This is my mother, Florence Olive Forsström Hallen. And this is min morfar, my mother's father, Turi Victor Forsström. He's my grandpa Terry when he gets Americanized. And the picture on the right of my screen, at least, is his passport picture from when he came to America in 1925. And the picture on the left, the smaller picture, is his wedding day in 1935. And then my grandpa's mother, min mors farmor, my mother's maternal grandmother, and my grandpa's mother, she's Britta Oliva Forsström. So I want to talk about the place that's involved here. My grandpa Terry was born in Ljusdorp Parish, Timrå District, Västernorrland County, Medelpad Province in Sweden on 9th of May, 1901. And the place is so important because, as you may have known from your own travels, there are some things you can only learn when you actually go to the homeland. You can only do so much from books and research and microfilms and online databases. If you go to the homeland, there are going to be treasures there, and you're going to find keys to unlock doors in your family research. Ljusdorp, Sweden, is a parish in a tract of forested farmland northwest of Sundsvall in the Medelpad district of the Västernorrland province. At the heart of the parish is a luminous white chapel and 2 red schools situated on a rise, surrounded by emerald fields and rolling hills. I'll give a little bit of history about that, about the fact that there's schools next to the chapels. One of the things that Martin Luther contributed in the Reformation of the church is that he believed that people should be able to read the scriptures. They should be able to read the Bible in their own language. And so education and religion went hand in hand as the Lutheran Church and other denominations developed from the Catholic Church. So almost every church in Sweden has a little school next to it, or used to have a little school next to it, so the children could learn to read. In Swedish, the place name Ljustorp is derived from the compound ljus, meaning light, and torp, meaning a croft or a farm property. This is Ljustorp, and it's such a beautiful place. I hope you can feel that. The reason I got to go there is my mother wanted to go back to Sweden, and I had an Emily Dickinson conference in Trondheim, Norway. And one of the things that I felt as I was there is that I was able to see light breaking forth as the morning. And I was able to get genealogical records for my family, as you'll see in a minute. And through that, build, as verse 12 says down there in chapter 58 of Isaiah, to build the old waste places and raise up the foundations of many generations. I can read that as a family history scripture. So in July of 2001, I visited Sweden for the first time. It was 100 years after the birth of my immigrant grandfather. I was accompanied by my mother, who introduced me to my grandfather's cousins, who were still alive at the time, Sven and Mary, in Sundsvall. As an offering to our relatives, I brought pedigree charts and family group sheets with the names of the ancestors I had gathered thus far. When I showed my little pack of family group sheets and charts to cousin Mary, she said, "Oh, I have a granddaughter doing this, and she speaks English." So I brought a sample of whatever names I'd been able to find so far. And we were in Sven's apartment in Sundsvall. And you'll see cousin Mary holding my mom's hand there in the middle of the couch, and Sven's daughter on my mom's side, and Sven's son-in-law on the other side. That's important because they took us to Ljustorp in their car, and Sven's on the phone telling people about our visit. We drove to Ljustorp, and it was a beautiful breezy day. The sunlight was making emerald fields, and then the clouds were making shady fields, and the breeze was blowing in a beautiful, soothing way, and I felt like the ancestor spirits were coming to meet us. And cousin Sven said that the door to Ljustorp's church was always locked these days to prevent vandalism. But then a man drove up to us and said, "Dörren är öppen nu." I forgot to put the right marks over the verbs. "Dörren är öppen nu, nu kan gå in," which means the door's open now, you can go in. So unexpectedly, we got to go in the church. And then Sven showed us the grave of his wife and still shed tears about Kerstin's passing, for the deep love that he held for her. And we saw the little school near the Minnesland section of the cemetery. And I learned from this experience of going to Sweden that there were records and databases available. My grandpa's cousin Mary had that granddaughter Gabriella that spoke English, and when we got to her house on the island of Ulno and across the water, the Sound from Sundsvall, she presented me with 23 pages of family group sheets and 11 pages of pedigree charts that she'd been gathering online. And then she drove us to see the parish records repository at Härnösand Archives. Now, this is the background of these. In 1688, Swedish rulers had mandated compulsory parish record keeping, not only for church registration purposes, but also for taxation and military conscription. Thus, Sweden has some of the most complete family history records in the world. They were already keeping records before 1688, but they became compulsory after that. So for generations, Lutheran church officials kept and archived parish registers, conscientiously recording the names, births, baptisms, confirmations, marriages, moves, and deaths of all the individuals in Sweden. And then microfilmed copies of those records became available through the Family History Library of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake City, Utah. That's how I was accessing my Swedish ancestors. But Sweden developed online databases. The Ruter and Archiv Digital and MyHeritage and Dispit are some of those that you may be familiar with. Well, my grandpa's cousin's daughter, Gabriella, for 1 year had been looking in the online Swedish records, and this is a sample of one of the 30 plus pages that she sent me. Like I said, 23 family group sheets and 11 pedigree charts. So it was a great treasure trove. And then she took us to see where the parish records had been gathered into archives north of there in Härnösand. So now I'm going to go to trip number 2 to Sweden. So after that amazing experience to meet my grandpa's family, I had to go back. This time I went back on a personal trip instead of a professional academic conference trip. And in August 2002, I stayed with Gabriella on Ulno Island across from Sundsvall. And we went back to Justorp, and Gabriella's grandma, Mary, showed us how to honor the graves of our relatives and ancestors in the Justorp Church Cemetery. As we toured the parish, she pointed out landmarks and villages. And then, this is the part that moves us closer to our topic, the Swedish naming patterns. Gabriella and I visited Annika and Lennart Lindqvist, our other Forsström cousins on Ulno Island, and they gave us a recently compiled book of Justorp inhabitants from 1500 to 1800, organized by family groups in 26 villages. So there's Mary and Gabriella back in Justorp. And then here's where Västernorrland lies, in that central east coast portion of Sweden. And there are the places that are relevant to where these names came from. Sundsvall is number 15 on this map. I hope you can see the bottom of the map in my PowerPoint. Ulno Island, where I was staying with Gabriella, where she lives and where we got the records, is number 16. Härnösand is up north. That's where they keep the archives, number 23. And then Justorp, the Croft of Light, is number 29. And then Justorp has all these little villages. Mellberg is where the church is, across from where the church sits. And then there's Huglan and Björkum and Jelvik and Hamre. They're not all on this map. But when I got that record from our cousins, Annika and Lennart, there was a list of 26 villages. And then while I was using this TypeScript database that I got from them for family history research, I noticed a great deal of name repetition and variation in the family groups. So I began doing linguistic research about Swedish onomastic patterns and naming practices to try to understand the data I was looking at. That's the title page and the copyright page of that book that I received. It wasn't a hardbound book, it was a softbound book. And I started studying the names of the people in the families as I was getting names for my direct line ancestors and collateral ancestors. And I noticed the name Olaf a lot. And I found out from counting the names in the household indexes at the back of the book that the most frequent male name for heads of household was Olaf, which is from Old Norse, meaning forefather and descendant. So even the most frequent name in Sweden, at least in Justorp, Sweden, because of the Saint Olaf culture. Olaf is the Norwegian king who helped implement the spread of Christianity in Scandinavia, in northern Sweden and Norway especially. And his name actually means forefather and descendant, which has a genealogical connotation that I really liked. But the most frequent female name that I noticed for heads of household was Brita, which comes from Celtic. It's a Gaelic Celtic word meaning great, sublime, or elevated. And it's the most popular woman's name or girl's name in Sundsvall. So as I studied further, the database that I had received, Justorp Börs 1500 to 1800, had 2,067 males and 1,919 females. In that whole database, there were 67 distinct male types of names. By type, I mean not all the iterations of a name like Olaf, but Olaf, Niels, Anders as individual name types. And there were 48 distinct female name types. But amazingly, as I did the calculations, 76% of all the males in Justorp at this time, period, share only 8 given names. And 75% of all females in Justorp in this time period share only 8 given names. So the most frequent names in Justorp for men were Olaf, Erik, Lars, Jonas, Niels, Per, Anders, and Johan. And these names, it just astounded me, accounted for 70% 6% of all the men. And the 8 most frequent female names were Brita, Anna, Katarina, Kristina, Märta, Margareta. I later on found out that Märta and Margareta actually go together. Märta is a reduction of Margareta, and Martha is also in that family, but I counted them separately then, and Ingrid and Sara. And these 8 names accounted for approximately 75% of the women in Ljustorp. So there was a huge amount of repetition and variation, repetition of the names, but variation on those names, so people could distinguish one person from another. In a range of about 3 centuries, just 16 different names accounted for 3/4 of all the masculine, feminine given names in Ljustorp parish. It means that reduplication and recycling of given names was very high in Ljustorp households. The given names that sons and daughters received in christening ceremonies were reiterated through multiple generations. And what's really pleasing to me is that these results are remarkably similar to those in an earlier study by Olaf Kronberg in 1988 of given names from 8,700 marriages in the Hult district. About 75% of males and females had the 10 most common names in that area of Scania in southern Sweden. So in southern Sweden, there's a parallel study that found similar data to what I found in northern Sweden. That was a nice confirmation of my research. As I was actually looking at the research pages, I began to notice some kind of a naming pattern. So you can see on this page 9 in Bredsfjord, Sweden, that we have Anders, Andersson, and we know his surname. From his surname Andersson, we know that his father was named Anders. Well, if you look at his first son is also named Anders. So his first son is named after his father, but he's also named after his grandfather. And then the second son, he has the name Lars, which you can see from the wife Karin Larsdotter's name. He's named after his mother's father. And then if you look at the third son, he's named Anders again after his father and father's father, but that's because the first Anders died. The first Anders was born in 1729, but he died in 1730. And so when another boy came along in 1733, in memory of the first Anders, and to continue the pattern of remembering the grandfather, they named the third son Anders again. This is where it becomes a namesake pattern. And then Sara, it turns out, this is why I spent so much time showing you the places. If you look to the far right of Karin Larsdotter's name, the mother's name, you see the name Uppum, number 11. Her family was living in another little farm croft, Uppum, a village in the same Ljustorp area. And if you go look at her in the book, her mother's name was Sara. So the first daughter is named after the mother's mother. And then it just so happens that the second daughter is named after the father's mother. When I go to Anders Andersson, where he was from, in number 5, family number 5, I can see that his mother's name was Maria. So that's where you can start to see the pattern. I didn't know the pattern yet, but I knew something was going on. And I knew it was something more than patronymics, because I kept asking. I was taking some Swedish classes, and I was looking online to find out what's going on here. And I could find stuff about a patronymic naming system, but it was always talking about the last names, the surnames. So, for example, Kimberly Powell says, until the turn of the 20th century, most Swedes followed a patronymic naming system practiced by about 90 to 95% of the populations. And it's the process of designating a surname based on the given name of the father. So changing the family surname from one generation to the next. I come from a long line of Hallens on my father's side. We all have the last name Hallen. And my siblings and I share that name until the daughters get married. But in this case, the names would change if the names of the parents and grandparents were different and depending on one's place in the birth order. So if we go back here, Anderson's last name is Anderson, obviously, and Karen's last name is Larsdotter, and she keeps that last name her whole life. And the children will get named after their dad's last name, but their first names come from somewhere else. And I knew something was going on in the first name. Okay, so then again, I found another source trying to understand the naming system, but I could tell, even though the system that Swedish last names are based on is called the patronymic system, this patronymics was not accounting for the larger pattern of first names that was fueling not just the last name or the surname, but it was fueling what the first names were. And that was what was causing the repetition. Okay. So I started to realize that the duplication of personal names across generations comes from the practice of naming children by birth order after close relatives, grandparents, parents, aunts, and uncles. This name repetition pattern is useful for family history research because the first names of the children refer back to the names of the ancestors. And the first names of the ancestors refer forward to the children. And that's a key that one can use to figure out who somebody's parents or grandparents are, or what a child might be named. If you have someone that's not named, and you can look at the parents and grandparents or maybe aunts and uncles' names and figure out what a child might be named. Or if there's a missing child, you can guess what a missing child, if there's a gap in your list of names, and you know somebody was probably born in that gap period, well, you can kind of guess what their name might be from the ancestors. So this pattern has three components: repetition of the same given names for different people. Number two, selection of a child's first name from a specific set of close family relationships. And number three, the assignment of the relative's name to the child according to birth order. Again, it's a flexible pattern because it has other variables that are going to affect it, just like mutations can happen when DNA is replicating because of different factors, right? Now, scholars have recognized this pattern, but there really wasn't a name for it. Some people call it the commemorative pattern. Some people call it patronymic, which is inadequate. Some people just call it the repetition pattern. In German, there was a name Nachbenennung to describe the namesake pattern, but I wasn't quite satisfied with any of those. And I decided to call it the Malachi namesake pattern based on a scripture in the Bible from Malachi, since the names of the relatives turn into the names of the children, and the names of the children turn back to the names of the relatives, which kind of matches that scripture. He shall turn the heart of the fathers or parents to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers or parents. So again, to reiterate, the Malachi naming pattern is the first son is named after the father's father, which can be abbreviated FF. The second son is named after the mother's father, MF. The third son is named after the father, F. The fourth son is named after an uncle, FB or MB, father's brother or mother's brother. First daughter is named after the father's mother, FM. Second daughter named after the mother's mother, MM. Third daughter named after the mother, M. Fourth daughter named after an aunt, so father's sister or mother's sister, FS or MS. In my database, the Justorpsbor, 1500 to 1800, 334 out of 574 families with at least one named son, meaning they had at least one son that they named it their first son after the father's father. And 184 out of 385 families named their second son after the mother's father. 62 out of 250 families. Now, the reason the numbers don't match in the number of families is because some people didn't have a second son. Some people didn't have a third son. So that's 252 families that had a third son. 62 of them named their third son after the father. And then 44 of 146 families named their fourth son after an uncle, a father's brother or mother's brother. And then for daughters, 226 of 574 families with at least one named daughter in Ljustorp named that first daughter after the father's mother. 102 out of 400 families named their second daughter after the mother's mother. 71 of 238 families named their third daughter after the mother. And 45 out of 134 families named their fourth daughter after an aunt. So you can see that it's not a total pattern that everyone is following. But again, as I mentioned, there are factors that are going to influence how far the pattern is going to go forward in each family. And we'll talk about that later. The cumulative tendencies are this. In the Ljustorp parish records, 89.72% of all parents named their first son either after the father's father, the mother's father, the father, or an uncle. So again, for the first son, if they didn't name it after the father's father, they named it after the mother's father, or they named him after the father, or they named him after an uncle. Almost 90% of the time, it was named after one of those relatives. And then there's always more variety in the women's naming patterns. 67.77% named their first daughter after the mother's father, the mother's mother, an aunt, or the mother. And so not as quite compliance or adherence to the pattern with the girls as with the boys. Naming is an area where there seems to be more variety and creativity with girls' names than with boys' names. And then similar tendencies are manifest for subsequent children in the birth order. So you could look at the second son and the second daughter, and you would see that a lot of times one of those close relatives is the source of the first names of the children. Now we get to take a look at this, and I don't know how much you can see as far as the small print here, but I just wanted you to get a look at the first page of the Ljustorpsbor inventory of family groups. I just marvel that such a thing existed for me as someone who loved my Swedish grandpa and loved my Swedish American family, as well as my Swedish relatives in Sweden. I loved them so much. And then when I got into the family history, I loved the ancestors so much. When I went to Sweden and felt the spirit of the homeland, I loved it so much. And to go back on the second trip and receive a database that organized every family with father, mother, and children was an astonishing treasury for me, as you can imagine. And it was so different from going to microfilms where things are organized by ordinance, right? I could find people before, but I had to look on the microfilm at all the baptisms in a particular year or time to find the name. And I had to look through all the marriages for a particular time period because things were done in the chronological order of the ordinances in that particular church. But someone, actually the someones are the author of this compilation, with the help of the record books in Ljustorp churches, and then when they were taken to the Härnösand archive, someone went through, Agneta and Folke, went through and took all those scattered names and gathered them into the integral family groups. Now, in some ways that was already done for them because there are parish record groups that group people by families, but they don't have every family member early on in the marriage. They would only have a couple children. And then later on, they would add the children. So you have to go to the last one to get an inventory of all the children. And if some of the children had died, they might not be there in the annual parish records or congregational records of the families. And so to have this all compiled was amazing. Now, you'll see that at the top, they didn't have any record for those people like Sigurd, who settled in Björkum in 1409, and Jon Sonnesson in 1535, and Niels Mikkelson in 1569. Guli Olsen, 1590. But they did know that they were in Bjorkum in the Ustorp area because of land records. They didn't have the church records started yet, but they did have land records. And so they were good enough to include those land record people too. And then you'll see the first person there is Niels Olsen in family number 1. It says 1673, number 1. That's the first family in Bjorkum's little sub-neighborhood. And he is married to Märta Paulsdotter. And their first son is named after the father's father, FF. I don't know about Christopher because I couldn't find any uncle or grandpa or father or brother named Christopher for this family. So where Christopher came from is still a mystery to me. Brita, though, is the father's mother. And then Segri, I haven't been able to find either. If I found Märta Paulsdotter, which I did look up, and I couldn't find Segrid as the name of Märta Paulsdotter. So I don't know where the Segri name comes either. So there's still plenty of mystery in this, but they do seem to be following the pattern somewhat. In the next family, 1680 settlers, number 2, Olaf Nielsen is married to Sara Olofsdotter. And Märta, their first daughter, is named after the father's mother. Their first son is named after both the father and the mother's father, interestingly enough. And then the second son is named after the father's father. And then Lars and Jonas, again, are mysteries. I cannot find them as brothers to either of the parents. And so I have to assume they're maybe close friends. Maybe if you know something about this, you'll put a comment for us in the chat. Where do these other names come from when they aren't using the family names as the namesakes? In family number 3, you see Daniel Olofsson and his wife, Brita Nielsdotter. And Niels is the mother's father, the first son. The second son, Olaf, is after the father's father. The first daughter is named after her mother. The second daughter is named Helena, or Ella, which is a clipping of Helena's. And Helena or Ella, I'm not sure. Daniel's mother's name Ursula. And I thought, well, is Ursula like Ella? Did they get the Ella from the end of Ursula? But then it has Helena as a name in parentheses. So that's still a mystery. But the next daughter, the third daughter, is named Brita. And you can probably guess why. The first Brita, that's child number 3, she died in 1706. So when number 5 comes along and they have another girl, they name her Brita as a namesake for the little girl who died. And so they carry on this pattern of remembrance through the naming. And then Niels is the name of the mother's father. We can see that from her surname above. And then Cecilia is actually, if we go to Daniel's page, family page in Hugland 17, we'll see that Cecilia is the name of Brita Nielsdotter's mother. Now, at this point, if we were in a classroom setting, I'd want to take questions. I'm a little too nervous to go to the chat and look at questions right now. So I hope you'll jot down your questions or keep them in mind for the end. I still want to keep going with this. I want to finish the page, and then I have other pages. If you want more practice, we can come back to this. But notice Anders Olofsson in 1692 has 2 wives. He has Helena Danielsdotter that he married in 1722, but she died in 1741. And then he has Brita Larsdotter that he married sometime after 1741, because the first wife died in 1741. And Anders and Helena had 8 children, and then Brita had 1 child. The 9th child, Lars, is the son of the second marriage. And let's see how the naming pattern holds up. It really holds up pretty well here. The first son, Olaf, is named after the father's father. The first daughter, number 2, but he does named after the mother's mother. Number 3 is a mystery because I couldn't find any Christinas anywhere in the family name panel. But number 4 is definitely named after the mother, meaning the first wife. And number 5 is named after the mother's father. We can see that if we just go to the corresponding parents in other places in the database. Number 5, Daniel, as I said, is named after the mother's father. Eric is the father's brother. And you'll see that Eric is the father's brother. Well, how do I know? Because if I go to family number 5, I can see Eric, the brother. Anyway, Eric, the brother, is there, but he's also in their family in Fortuna, Anders Olafsson. Okay, I'm getting a little muddy in my explanation because the details, there are multiple details, but if you look back in family number 4, Anders Olafsson, who I was talking about, that married 2 wives, then if I look at Fortuna number 35, then I find out that he had a brother named Eric, and then Eric is number 6 here. And then Anders is named after the father. And then Karin, I couldn't find anyone named Karin in their family. But Lars, the next son, is named after the mother's father of the second wife. Okay. I hope you've been able to keep up with that, especially now you can see it better. And I have more pages if we need to go over it. I've got pages that show these kind of relationships. I'll just gloss through them briefly. So for example, in the Bjorkum number 2, which is a district of the village that has another conclave of families. Family number 8, Eric Olafsson, first son is named after father's father, and the first daughter, Jolene, is named after the father's mother. And then on page 3, we have more families. I put check pluses to the right side of these because these people are really following the pattern. Olaf Eriksson and Maria Isaksdotter have a daughter named after the father's mother. Their second daughter, Anna, is named after the mother's mother. Then they had a baby that was born dead, a stillborn baby that didn't get a name. So we don't know if it's a boy or a girl because the name is our clue to that. But then as soon as they get the first son that lives, Eric, number 4 child, is named after the father's father. Then in the next family, Olaf Ingmarsson married to Kerstin Olofsdotter, family number 10. First daughter named after father's mother, second daughter named after mother's mother, first son named after the mother's father and the father. That always makes it interesting. Because of the name repetition being ubiquitous, then you can get these combo names where a person has a double memorial name. And then Ingmar is obviously the father's father from Olaf Ingmarsson's surname. And then one more that really shows the pattern well. Olaf Olafsson is married to Jolene Mortensdotter, first son named after the father and the father's father, second son named after the father's mother, Kerstin, which I found by looking at number 10. So this is where you can see the connections because the names, the families are living in close proximity to each other. So if you hop back up to number 10, you see Olaf Ingmar's wife, Kerstin, and then the very first daughter that they have in family 11 is Kerstin. And then the second son, as in the strict pattern, Morten, or Martinus in Latin, is named after the mother's father, and Katarina is named after the mother's mother. Okay, I hope that is fun for you. And again, I'm going to look forward to seeing your comments. There's a lot more that I could show you, but it might get bogged down. And I have other patterns to discuss with you. But again, these are things that can help us appreciate the order and the beauty of this network, this tapestry of naming based on remembrance, and just a powerful testament to the close-knit families. I'm not saying they had perfect families and or making any comment about the quality of their family life, but they had a system that encoded remembrance and respect for elders and honoring of ancestors, as many cultures do across the earth. And then here in Högland, we have an interesting situation. If you look at Högland, another village in the Ljustorp parish, the second family is the family of Hans Ingmarsson, and they could tell from the record that the last name of Hans's wife was Nielsdotter, but they didn't know her first name when they were compiling this record. And so I tried to do some research about that using the name pattern. And at first, I thought maybe that the first name of Hans's wife was Märta, that she was Märta Nielsdotter. You can see my little penciled note above her name. But then as I studied and found other records online, it wasn't Märta, which I thought because of family number 3, Ingmar Hansson and Kristin Eliasdotter named their first daughter Märta. So I thought, well, that's the father's mother. So I thought maybe her name was Märta, but it turns out that the mother's name was Anna. They didn't follow the pattern strictly, and Anna was the 4th daughter, not the first daughter. So in using this, we can't overdo it as a means for gauging what a name might be. We just have to use it as a tool, but it's not a rigid pattern. It's a flexible pattern. All right, now we'll keep going. So I want to talk about mutation and what causes mutations and complications. I hope that where I have these bars isn't blocking what you see on the PowerPoint, but since it's share screen, it might be. So let me try to move things out of the way a bit. Okay, so this page says mutations and complications. 114 out of 773 families had no children, so they had no way to implement the naming pattern, okay? They had no children. 85 out of 659 families that did have children, they didn't have any sons. And 85 out of 659 had no daughters. And out of the 659 families that had children, very few had 8 children that was exactly 4 sons and 4 daughters, which the pattern is based on, right, as a template. And very few of the 659 families followed the exact pattern, even if they did have 8 children. Okay, there were other factors. For example, infant mortality triggered renaming, as you saw. And then stillborns and unchristian infants weren't counted in the birth order. So even though a child was born, if it didn't get baptized, then the naming pattern went to the next born child or son or daughter. And then spouse mortality and widowers or widows remarriage triggered the pattern again, because now you have a new spouse, you have a new spouse's parents to name children after. And then some parents and children are not identified by name. Even if the daughter wasn't stillborn, her name might not be available in the archive or in the record that you're looking at, the microfilm that you're looking at. And some parents might not be identified. You know that there's a spouse, or maybe there's unwed mother, and so the father's name is not known. And so you can't know what the father's name is to know if a child is named after the father, stuff like that. And then some names are not namesakes, like my mystery Christopher. And then clipping or compounding may obscure name repetition and variation, meaning if the name has been clipped, like if Nicholas has been clipped into Niels, but then somebody decides to use that compound Nicolas or Nicolas, Klaus, they might name the child Klaus from Nicholas instead of Niels from Nicholas. And you might not realize that Klaus is actually being named after his grandfather Niels, because Niels is a clipping of Nicholas. So those kind of things, that's where the name variants come to play in understanding these patterns. So here's some sample of clippings, reductions, and nicknames that can affect the naming pattern. Brita, as I mentioned earlier, comes from Birgitta, which comes from Irish Bridget. And Bridget was a Celtic goddess of family and fertility and much esteemed. And then one of the female Christians was named Britta, and she became a saint, a very, very popular saint in Northwestern Europe, in Scandinavia and the British Isles. And so Britta became one of the top names in Sweden with all sorts of spelling variations. Jun, it's not short for Jonathan. It's not short for John or Johan. Jun is from Jonas, which is the Swedish word for Jonah, the prophet that got swallowed by a whale. So a lot of people that name Johnson are not really sons of John, they're sons of Jonah. And in linguistics, you'll see when there's that much similarity in the spelling and in the phonetic pronunciation of something, that those will start to merge. And so you may not be able to tell if your Johnson is from Jonas, Jonah, or from John, Johann. And interestingly enough, when Johann gets reduced, first of all, it's Johann is a double name. And so it gets clipped into Jan. It actually gets smushed. You'll notice that the J comes off of Johann, and the end of Han, the AN, goes on Jan. So if you have someone whose name is Janssen, they're the son of Johann. They're not the son of Jonas, unless there's been a mix-up. And then because Johann gets smushed, they put the umlaut over the O, and so sometimes you'll see it as Jun instead of Jan. Jun or Juns with an S on it. And then the biggest surprise is Hans. The name Hans is not an independent name on its own. It's the second half of Johann. In some places I've seen Katarina, which has multiple variations, merge with Christina nicknames and clippings. So for example, somebody might be named Dina or Tina, and you don't know if it's coming from Katarina with a T in the middle, or if it's coming from Christina with a T before the Ina, right? So sometimes that'll happen. Lena can either come from Helena or from Magdalena. And hopefully you have a mother's mother or a father's mother that can help you to discern whether that Lena is from a Magdalena or a Helena. And then Marit is related to Merta. And then I found out that they're both related to Martha, which is a reduction of Margareta. But Margareta is also a compound name. And so Margareta, instead of becoming Margreta or Merta, will also just become Greta. And then Maria will show up as Maya, and Juliana will show up as Yuli. Notice that that's mostly a spelling variation, with that G having a soft palate sound rather than ghoulie. It's kind of fun when you hear someone reading these and saying ghoulie, which sounds a bit ghoulish, when it's really the just sound. So here are some of the variations. I'll try not to be too tiresome for you. I don't want to be tiresome. So if you look at the chart with me, so our English name Anne, Annetta, Annika, Anna, Annika with two N's. So there are spelling variations as well as actual name variations. And what I'm recommending is that any variations, if you need further data about someone named Anna and you're not finding any sources to attach to her, if you're in family search, go to the additional information box under the details on the person page and click alternate names and put in these variations. And I'll show you examples where I found source documents that enable me to continue my research because I put in ahead of time. Now, many people have been raised on what is called the the gold standard of genealogical research, where you don't put anything into a database until you have a record. And I am very much in support of being cautious about putting in extraneous, unsupported data into a family search person page. But we live now with miraculous search engines. And I have found over and over again, if I put these name variants into the search engine in alternate names, that search engine, which does not sleep or slumber, will go searching for source documents or duplicates for me to attach or to review. And I have found countless names, and I've been able to attach sources that weren't available right into the family search page. And then Ancestry and MyHeritage will pick up on that. And the next thing you know, I've got sources for people that didn't have sources before. So there are many ways to do research. One is to use the sources to find the names of people. And the other is to use the names to find the sources. And we need both working together, but do not be afraid to put in variants ahead of time. Many of you know this and do this, but for those who, like me, didn't realize that that would be appropriate, it is appropriate. Beatrice is Beata, but I found it once spelled Beata. Bridget, as I mentioned, Brita with 2 T's, Brita with 1 T, sometimes Brita with an H after the T. I didn't even put them all in there. There's so many. And then the full form Birgitta. Carolyn might show up as Carolina with either spelling, same pronunciation for both of those because the schwa is not a silent. In Carolina with an E at the end, that's not a sneaky E like in English, Caroline. Catherine can be Kaisa, Katarina, Katarina with a K, Katarina with a K and a TH, Kaisa with a K, Karin. The word Karen comes from Catherine. They all mean pure. The word Catherine means pure. And it's a Greek name that, again, because there were saints named after, we have many biblical names like Anna, but we also get religious names from Greek and Latin because of saints who were named after that. And then we get standard Germanic names that predate the Christian era. Charlotte is another form of Carolina. Christina, look at all the different ways that Christina might show up. Kerstin, Christ, abbreviated. Christine, Christina, Kirsten or Shersten, Kristen or Christina with a K, and then Stina. And Stina's the sneaky one because the Christ part is not there. You just have the Stina part. And so you might not think that that's Christina, but it is. Elizabeth might be abbreviated. It might be with or without the H. It might be Elsa. It might be Lisa. It might be Lisbeta or Lisbeta with an H. Angela might be Angela or Angela. Julie can be Yuli or Yulene or Juliana with a J sometimes. And then some of the more traditional Germanic ones like Gunborg and Gunilla don't have an English corresponding form usually. Hedvig, Heda, Helen, Ellen, Ella, Ellen, Helena, Lena. Ingjal and Ingjal don't have English correspondence. Ingrid is though, and there's Ingrid and Ingrid. If you have Joanna, that's a compound, so see Anna. Marlene in English could be Lena, Magdalena, Maglena, or Malin. And then Margareta, as I said, probably can merge with Martha, Greta, Margareta, and then if you look down at Marta, Marit, Marit, Merta, Martha, Merta. The H is not a th sound, it's aspiration. So if you look at Martha, we say it in English with a Martha, but in Germanic languages, that H just means the T is aspirated with a puff of air. So it's Marta and Merta. And then another one that's Norse that doesn't have an English correspondent, but has variations, Seger, Segrid, Sigri, etc., and then Ulrich, Ulla, Ulrika, Ulrika, etc. And then Ursula, Ursula. Now, I'm going to go more quickly through the next slides. So I'm going to show you the men's names, and you got the picture from the women's names, that there are variants. Some of them are predictable, and they're just spelling variations, but some of them, the ones that are most interesting to me, are the compounds that break down, like Hans and John, which we've already talked about. And then don't forget that if a person had an office in the church, even in the Lutheran church after the Catholic era in Sweden, you'll find that people that are in the priesthood of the church, so if they're a pastor of the Lutheran church or have some kind of calling or job or employment with the church, their names may show up in a Latin form. So Lars is a very common Swedish name for us, but did you know that Lars came from Lawrence? I didn't. And that sometimes in the Swedish records, Lars will be Laurentius if he's a church leader. Martin has different spellings and pronunciations. Måns, the round circle over the A will make it into an O sound. And then Mats, Michael, Klaus, I already told you about. Niels is the more common form, one of the most common names in Scandinavian, but sometimes it shows up as Klaas or Klaus. Olaf is the most common name of all. That's why I highlighted in yellow. And there's Olas, Olaf, Oluf, Oluf. And I found one Roluf, but I think it's related to a different name. I wasn't going to read all those, but they're all interesting to me. There's Roland with Roluf. And so you can see this various name patterns. Now, I sometimes use the naming pattern for creative genealogy and onomastic endeavors. There was a child, Märta Brita's daughter, and the identity of her father was unknown. But my heritage doesn't work if you don't have a first name and a last name, or some functions don't work if you don't have something in the first and last name field. And so I decided to create a matronymic surname for her. So instead of a patronymic surname, which would have been Märta Mystery's daughter, because we didn't know his name, I decided to use her mother's name, and I called her Märta Brita's daughter, just so she could have a full name in the system. And then here's the fun part. Here's my evidence that if you will put the name variation, the alternate name, in the other information box, you can get records. So I had this man named Thomas Olofsson, but the Thomas was spelled T-O-M-A-S, and it didn't have the H in it that we're used to, T-H. It would still be pronounced Thomas in many languages because it's just aspiration, right? We don't say Thomas, right? We say Thomas. And when I put that spelling in there as an alternate name, as well as a reduction of the surname Olofsson to Olsen, I got a baptism record. If you look over there on research help, Thomas shows up as a baptism record. And when I clicked on that, it gave me all the information that I was missing. I got a birth date and other things. So that's why I think of these Swedish naming patterns as a key to our research. Peter gets reduced to Per with an H, but most often in my database, it gets reduced to P-E-R, just Per. But I had trouble finding information on Per Olofsson. So again, I reduced his name. Well, I didn't reduce it, I actually augmented it. I put him as Peter, which Peter is the main name for Per. And then I also put the spelling with the H, and next thing you know, you'll see the H spelling yielded me a baptismal document. And when I went to the baptismal document, I got more information about Per and his birth and baptism date and family. Now here's the same name game. It's a tale of two couples, and it's my little quiz for you. Here are two men named Lars Nielsen and Lars Nielsen, who were both from Ljustorp. The first, Lars Nielsen, however, was born in 1732 in Hugland village of Ljustorp, and the second was born in 1745 in Tuna, Eustorp. So 2 different villages in the parish. Now, who do you think is married to who? We have Karen Olafsdottir, born in Sterneset, Alno, in 1738. I'm going chronologically in this diagram. And we have Karen Olafsdottir, born in 1749 in Eustorp. And as you know, Alno sits across the water from Sundsvall, which is just south of Eustorp. So they're in the same vicinity. So even though the 2 Karens are not both born in Eustorp, they're born in the same area of Västernorrland. Okay, I showed you on the maps earlier. So the question is, which Karen do you think is married to which Lars? And if you want to put your answer in the chat, and we'll check on it later, you can do that. So do you think that Lars Nielsen, the older, is married to Karen from Alno, born in 1738? Or do you think that Lars Nielsen in 1732 was married to Karen that was born in 1749? Now, I'll just go ahead. You think about it for a minute. Oops, I think I'm going to give away the answer. Did you have time to think about it? I would take a hand poll if we were in a classroom together, but I'm just going to go ahead and do the spoiler. Much to my surprise, as I did the research using my Eustorp Spår book, Lars Nielsen in Högland was married to the Karen Olafsdottir, the younger, born in 1749. And Lars Nielsen, the younger, was married to Karen Olafsdottir, the senior. And I had evidence from the records that I had, meaning that Lars Nielsen and Karen Olafsdottir that were in Eustorp only had 2 children in my book, the ones from Högland, whereas Lars Nielsen Jr. and Karen Olafsdottir Sr., the ones that are in Ulno, they had multiple children in my database. But in Family Search, somebody, most logically, understandably, thought that Lars, born in 32, was married to Karen, born in 38. So all of the children of the bottom 2 were attached to the top 2. So Lars Nielsen of Tuna and Karen Olafsdottir of Sterneset, Ulno didn't have their children attached to them because the children had been mushed and merged with the children of Lars 1732 and Karen Olafsdottir 1749. And then I had to do what I call the Ben Carson surgery. Ben Carson was the man who successfully separated conjoined twins. And I have to then separate conjoined families, which is a very labor-intensive but delightful process. I enjoy getting these families sorted out. It's exhilarating to me to get the right people married to each other and the right children attached to them. After I did that surgery, the nice thing is that I was able to find a document that confirmed that decision. I found a Karen Olafsdottir with an H in it, and when I clicked on it, she was the one that had the children in Ulnu, and she's the one born in 1749. And so again, putting in the name variant enabled me to have confirmation that it was right for me to split up the 2 Karens and get the children with the right family. And so it's very gratifying. One of the 2 couples, Lars Nielsen and his wife, had 2 daughters named Brita. But in Family Search, they had the first Brita's birth date and the second Brita's death date, which means that the children were attached to a little girl who died when she was 1 year old. So using the tools that I'm sharing with you, I found a death record for the first Brita that verified that she died on the 4th of January, 1778. And then I was able to take the children from the little baby that died in infancy and put them on the second Brita, who was her namesake, the one that she was named after, and give her her children that she was missing. So using name variants for research is best. It's optimal if you put names, dates, and places and work together with those. That's why I took the time to show you my people and my places and the dates that are relevant to me, because that's what we're doing when we're working with people of record, as well as our living family members. And even an estimated date can help bring up a source document. So just as I recommended that you not be afraid to put in name variants, I think you can follow the example of some of our other Sunday webinar experts and put estimated dates from the time of marriage, subtracting down to a possible birth date, or from the time of a birth of a child, estimating that the parents were probably married the year before in a society that valued marriage contracts and covenants. Why are there so many variations in Swedish given names? The more frequent a name is, the more likely it is to have variations. That's a linguistic principle. And this results from the need to distinguish one individual from another when they have the same or similar names. And then we have the role of two-part names from Hebrew and other Semitic languages of the Bible. Germanic languages also have two-part names. Asian languages have compound names. I had a neighbor named Mei Lin, which meant beautiful flower, I think. And then a lot of Native American, ancient Native American languages have two-part names. I believe some of the Mayan names. And so those create variations, and they did so in the Swedish given names. Then remember the common spelling variations. I didn't make an exhaustive list, just some example. And then many of the names, as I mentioned, are religious or biblical, and they've been translated so many times in various language and cultures that might explain multiple name variations depending on what Bible translation or religious source is being accessed. I won't elaborate, but there's the Malachi given name pattern again. Just wanted to summarize the main findings for those of you coming in later. And then my conclusion is a reiteration that the names of the children turn to the parents and the names of the parents turn to the children in Swedish family records. And this provides data for not only academic research and onomastics, but that onomastic research, studying names, learning more about name patterns is very useful for family research, history research. So I'll end with a scripture from the New Testament, because I told you that when I got to Eustorp, the door was going to be locked and we weren't going to be able to go into the church. But then the man came out of nowhere and opened the church and told us, you can go in now. And there's a scripture in Revelation, these things said he that is holy, he that is true, he that hath the key of David, he that openeth and no man shutteth, and shutteth and no man openeth. I know thy works. Behold, I have set before thee an open door, and no man can shut it. For thou hast a little strength, and hast kept my word, and hast not denied my name. I believe as we're looking for the names of our ancestors, we are involved in a holy work, and that keys will be given to us. And I'll say to you what the Swedish man said to us: the door is open now. The door is open now for you. The door is open now for me. The door is open now for us. The door is open for our ancestors to be reaching out to us and helping us to find them. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Cynthia. We do have about 3 questions. Let me give you the first question that's on the Q&A.
Okay.
From Christina.
Hi.
Are these naming patterns happening today? And if not, why did the pattern stop?
Oh, it's such a good question. Yes, I'm sure that some people continue the naming patterns, not only in Swedish but in other places. This pattern is, for example, a pattern of Scottish names. And some parents choose to continue to name their children after those close relatives. They may not find the birth order, but they may go out of their way. I have a family, a former student of mine, he and his wife go out of their way to include parent and grandparent names as each child comes along. And they don't do it so much by the birth order, they do it more by a feeling about the child that's coming. And then why did the pattern stop? In Sweden, about the middle of the 19th century, meaning the 1800s, there started to be industrialization that changed marriage patterns, changed employment patterns, and then there were political changes. And even though the Lutheran Church is still the main church of Sweden, it stopped being the government church, meaning they no longer mandated that churches had to keep the kind of records. They probably still do keep some records, but it no longer was a government mandate to do that. So some of these patterns were based on cultural traditions, but also government policies. And about the turn of the century, there were many, many changes. And Sweden became what is known as a secular Christian nation. They still had all the Christian heritage, and they didn't tear down churches. Wherever you go in Sweden, you'll see those beautiful white churches with their sunburst signs of light, because they're treated as treasures still, but the government and the culture itself became more secular. And that's one reason why the naming patterns stopped. But then people still may have an instinct to remember their ancestors, and so it is still happening today.